The morning bell echoed across the sleepy suburban town of Reston, Virginia, summoning children into the warm confines of Willow Creek Elementary School. It was one of those late autumn mornings where golden leaves scattered across the playground and the crisp air carried the laughter of children playing. Parents parked their cars hurriedly, saying goodbyes to their little ones, while teachers ushered the students toward their classrooms. It was a day like any other, routine, predictable, ordinary. But nothing about what was about to happen that day would be ordinary. At exactly 8:42 a.m., as the last few children ran toward the entrance, a silence fell over the yard. A figure emerged from the edge of the school grounds, where the thick woods bordered the property. It moved with slow, deliberate steps, its massive form casting a shadow over the asphalt. A lion. For a moment, no one moved. The children froze, their laughter strangled into silence. Teachers at the doors stopped mid-sentence, their smiles fading into expressions of disbelief and fear. The animal was enormous, its golden mane like a halo of fire against the gray morning sky. Its amber eyes scanned the yard, calm but unyielding. And then something even stranger happened. The lion sat down, regal and composed, right in the center of the playground. In its mouth was a piece of paper, a letter, folded neatly and clamped gently between its teeth. The first scream came from a mother in the parking lot, followed by chaos. Children were hurriedly pulled inside the building. Teachers frantically called for lockdown procedures, their voices shaky with panic. The principal, Mr. Harmon, locked the main entrance as he peered nervously through the glass door at the enormous predator sitting just meters away. But amidst the chaos, one person didn't run. 8-year-old Tatiana, a quiet girl with chestnut curls and oversized glasses, stood frozen by the swing set. Her hands clutched the straps of her pink backpack, and her blue eyes were locked on the lion. While others saw a predator, Tatiana saw something different, something she couldn't explain, but felt deep in her heart. "Tatiana," her teacher, Mrs. Delaney, called from the door, her voice trembling. "Get inside now." But Tatiana didn't move. Slowly, cautiously, she began to walk toward the lion. Gasps rippled through the adults watching from the safety of the building. Mr. Harmon shouted something into his phone, likely to the police, but all eyes were now on Tatiana, the small figure in the pink sweater, walking toward the beast. The lion didn't move, its gaze fixed on her, unblinking but calm, as if it had been waiting for her all along. When she was only a few feet away, Tatiana stopped. Her tiny hands trembled as she reached out, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "It's okay. I know you're not here to hurt us." The lion blinked, its great head tilting slightly as if to acknowledge her words. "Tatiana, stop!" Her father's voice shouted from somewhere behind her. She didn't look back. Instead, she held out her small hand toward the lion, palm open, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The lion slowly lowered its head, placing the folded letter at her feet. It lingered there for a moment, staring into her eyes with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Then, without a sound, it turned and padded away, disappearing back into the woods as silently as it had come. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with disbelief, fear, and something else, something unspoken. Tatiana bent down and picked up the letter, her fingers shaking as she unfolded it. The paper was worn and crinkled, the edges smudged with dirt. On it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "To Tatiana, from Mom." The world seemed to spin around her. Tears welled in her eyes as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was impossible. Her mother had died 2 years ago in a car accident. Tatiana held the letter close to her chest, her knees buckling as she sank to the ground. Behind her, the teachers and parents began to approach cautiously, their curiosity outweighing their fear. Mr. Harmon knelt beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "What does it say, Tatiana?" Through her tears, she read aloud, "My dearest Tatiana, I know you miss me and I miss you too. But you need to be brave, my little lion heart. There are things in this world that can't be explained, and that's okay. Just know that I'm always with you, watching over you, loving you. When you see the lion, you'll know it's me, and you'll know it's time to be strong. Love, Mom." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the yard. The lion was gone, but the message it left behind was undeniable. Tatiana hugged the letter tightly, her tears falling freely now. And as she looked back toward the woods where the lion had disappeared, she whispered, "I love you too, Mom." The playground was silent in the aftermath of the lion's departure. Teachers and parents slowly ushered the children into the building, but their movements were robotic, their minds consumed by what they had just witnessed. Tatiana remained on the ground, clutching the letter to her chest like a lifeline, her face streaked with tears. Inside the school, chaos simmered beneath the surface. The police arrived within minutes, swarming the campus with sirens blaring and radios crackling. Officers fanned out, searching the woods for any sign of the lion, but it was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. In the principal's office, Tatiana sat on a small chair, her pink backpack forgotten in the corner. Beside her were Mr. Gao, Harmon, Mrs. Delaney, and Officer Russell, a kind-faced man who crouched in front of her, speaking in a low, reassuring voice. "Tatiana," he began, "I know this is a lot to take in, but can you tell me more about the lion? Did it seem angry? Was it growling?" Tatiana shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, it was calm. It didn't want to hurt anyone." Officer Russell exchanged a glance with Mr. Harmon, who cleared his throat awkwardly. "Tatiana," the principal said, "this letter? Are you sure it's from your mom?" Tears welled in her eyes again. She didn't answer. Instead, she unfolded the paper and stared at the familiar handwriting. The loops of the letters, the way the Y curled at the end, it was hers. There was no doubt in Tatiana's mind. "I know it's her," she whispered. The adults exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Delaney reached out, placing a hand on Tatiana's shoulder. "Sweetheart, sometimes when we miss someone very much, we might imagine things. It doesn't mean they're not with us in spirit, but..." "I didn't imagine it." Tatiana's voice cracked as she looked up, her eyes blazing with a mix of frustration and pain. "She's gone, but she sent that lion. She sent it to tell me something." Mrs. Delaney recoiled slightly, her heart aching for the little girl. The room fell silent, the adults unsure of how to proceed. By lunchtime, the news had spread like wildfire. Parents crowded the front office, demanding answers. Reporters camped outside the school gates, their cameras trained on the building. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How did a lion end up on school grounds, and what did it mean? In the cafeteria, Tatiana sat alone at a corner table, her untouched sandwich in front of her. The other kids whispered and stared, their curiosity mingled with fear. Tatiana didn't care. She was too consumed by the letter, reading it over and over again until the words blurred. Her mother had always called her Lionheart. It was their special nickname, a private joke that no one else understood. Every time Tatiana had faced something scary, like the first day of kindergarten or getting her flu shot, her mom would kneel down, look her in the eyes, and say, "You're my brave little Lionheart." But Tatiana hadn't felt brave since the accident. She hadn't felt anything but hollow. The loss of her mother had turned her world upside down, leaving a void that no one could fill. Not her dad, not her friends, not even time. Now, holding the letter in her hands, she felt something stir inside her for the first time in 2 years. It wasn't just grief or confusion. It was something deeper, something stronger. Hope. That night, as the town buzzed with speculation, Tatiana sat in her bedroom, staring out the window at the woods behind her house. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lion wasn't gone, that it was still out there, watching, waiting. "Mom," she whispered into the darkness, "if you really sent that lion, why? What do you want me to do?" Her father knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You okay?" Tatiana hesitated before nodding. She didn't want to tell him about the letter. Not yet. He wouldn't understand. No one would. Her dad sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "The police said they couldn't find the lion. They think it might have come from a wildlife sanctuary a few towns over, but..." He trailed off, his expression clouded with doubt. "But what?" Tatiana asked. He shook his head. "It doesn't make sense. Lions don't act like that. They're wild animals. They don't just show up, drop off a letter, and walk away." Tatiana's heart raced. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't just a wild animal, that it was more, that it was a messenger. But the words caught in her throat. Her dad leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Try to get some sleep, okay? We'll figure this out." As he left the room, Tatiana made up her mind. She couldn't wait for answers to come to her. If the lion was still out there, she had to find it. The next morning, before the sun rose, Tatiana slipped out of the house with the letter tucked safely in her pocket. The woods behind her home were thick and quiet, the kind of place that felt alive with unseen eyes. She walked deeper and deeper, her breath visible in the chilly air. She didn't know what she was looking for or how she'd find it, but she kept going, driven by something she couldn't explain. After what felt like hours, she came to a small clearing bathed in golden light. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw it. There, lying calmly in the grass, was the lion. Its amber eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Tatiana stepped closer, her fear melting away with each step. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want me to do?" The lion didn't answer, of course, but as it stared at her, Tatiana felt a warmth spread through her chest, like sunlight breaking through a storm. The letter in her pocket seemed to hum with energy, and suddenly she understood. Her mother hadn't sent the lion to scare her, or even just to comfort her. She had sent it to remind her of who she was, of the strength that had always been inside her. She was her mother's lion heart. And it was time to be brave. Tatiana stood in the clearing, her breath visible in the cold morning air, facing the lion. The golden beast radiated calm, as if its very presence was meant to soothe the turbulence inside her heart. But for all the stillness in that moment, Tatiana could feel the weight of a decision looming over her. What was she supposed to do? The lion's amber eyes bore into hers, unwavering. It blinked slowly, almost deliberately, before turning its great head toward a narrow trail at the edge of the clearing. Then it stood, majestic and graceful, and began walking toward it. Tatiana hesitated. The woods were dense, unfamiliar, and her dad would wake up soon. But something stronger than fear pulled at her, something she couldn't ignore. Her small hands balled into fists as her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You're my brave little lion heart." With a deep breath, Tatiana followed. The trail was faint, winding deeper into the forest where the trees grew closer together, their branches like skeletal hands blocking out the early light. The lion moved ahead of her, its massive paws silent on the leaf-strewn ground. Every now and then it glanced back, as if checking to make sure she was still there. Tatiana's heart pounded with every step. What was she doing? This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. A lion appearing out of nowhere, a letter from her mom, and now this. She swallowed hard, gripping the letter in her pocket. And then, as the path opened up into another clearing, she saw it, a tree. But not just any tree. It was enormous, ancient, its gnarled roots twisting into the earth like veins. Its branches reached high into the sky, some of them bare, others adorned with fiery autumn leaves that shimmered in the golden light. At the base of the tree was something that made Tatiana's breath catch in her throat. A small stone, weathered and moss-covered, but unmistakably a grave marker. Her mother's grave. Tatiana froze. She hadn't been to the grave since the funeral. It was too painful, too raw. Her father had always visited alone, leaving flowers or saying a prayer, but Tatiana couldn't bring herself to go. Seeing her mom's name etched into stone made it all too real. Now, as she stood before it, the grief surged back like a tidal wave. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt by the marker, her fingers brushing over the carved letters. Margaret E. Bennett, beloved mother, forever in our hearts. The lion lay down beside her, its head resting on its paws, watching her quietly. It didn't seem wild or threatening. It felt like a guardian, a silent companion sharing in her sorrow. Tatiana pulled the letter from her pocket, her hands trembling. She read the words again, her mother's handwriting as familiar as her own. "When you see the lion, you'll know it's me, and you'll know it's time to be strong." "What do you want me to do, Mom?" Tatiana whispered, her voice breaking. "How can I be strong when you're not here?" The lion let out a soft rumble, almost like a purr. Its presence was steady, grounding. And suddenly, Tatiana remembered something. Something her mother had told her a long time ago, before the accident. It was during one of their bedtime stories, when her mom had read her a tale about a lioness protecting her cubs. Tatiana had asked why the lioness wasn't afraid of anything, and her mom had smiled and said, "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Tatiana. It means you keep going, even when you are." Tatiana looked at the lion. "Is that what you're trying to tell me?" she asked softly. The lion blinked, slow and deliberate, before nudging its massive head against her shoulder. It wasn't an answer, not in words, but it was enough. Tatiana reached into her backpack, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a photograph of her and her mom laughing, her arms wrapped around Tatiana as they posed for a selfie at the zoo. She had brought it with her that morning, not knowing why. Now, she carefully laid it at the base of the grave. "I miss you," she said, her voice trembling. "I miss you so much." The lion rumbled again, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her chest. And as she sat there, staring at the grave, the warmth in her chest grew stronger, spreading through her entire body. She wasn't alone. Her mom might not be there in the way she wanted, but she was there, in the letter, in the lion, in the memories and love that Tatiana carried with her. As the sun climbed higher, Tatiana stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. She turned to the lion, her eyes steady now. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing me here." The lion regarded her for a long moment, its amber eyes full of something deep and unfathomable. Then, with a low chuffing sound, it stood and began to walk back toward the woods. Tatiana watched it go, a strange mix of sadness and peace filling her heart. "Goodbye," she whispered. The lion stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking back one last time. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows like a dream fading with the morning light. When Tatiana returned home, her dad was waiting for her on the porch, his face pale with worry. "Tatiana, where were you? I was about to call the police." She hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I had to go to the woods," she said finally. "The woods? Tatiana, you know how dangerous that is." He pulled her into a tight hug, his voice trembling. "Don't ever do that again, okay?" Tatiana nodded, though she knew in her heart she had done the right thing. "I'm sorry, Dad." As they went inside, she glanced back toward the woods, half expecting to see the lion watching her. But the edge of the forest was quiet, still. That night, as Tatiana lay in bed, she clutched the letter to her chest. For the first time since the accident, the ache in her heart didn't feel so heavy. She still missed her mom, and she always would. But now, she knew she could be brave. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind one last time. "You're my brave little Lionheart." And Tatiana believed it. The days that followed felt like a quiet transformation in Tatiana's world. Something deep inside her had shifted. The sorrow that had once consumed her like an endless storm didn't vanish. It was still there, ebbing and flowing in the quiet moments, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. Instead, there was a new feeling growing in her chest: strength. At school, whispers about the lion continued to spread. Some kids asked Tatiana about it directly, their eyes wide with curiosity, but she only smiled softly and said, "It wasn't scary. It was just special." To Tatiana, the lion had been more than an animal. It had been a messenger, a guide, a reminder. She knew not everyone would understand that, and that was okay. She carried the memory of the lion and the letter like a secret treasure in her heart. Her teacher, Mrs. Delaney, noticed the change first. Tatiana, who had always been so quiet and withdrawn since her mother's death, began raising her hand in class. She answered questions, joined group projects, and even helped a boy named Tommy when he was struggling with math. "Tatiana," Mrs. Delaney said one afternoon, stopping her after class, "I've been meaning to tell you, you seem different lately. Happier, maybe." Tatiana blinked, caught off guard. She thought for a moment, then nodded. "I think I am." At home, her father noticed the change too. They had dinner together every night, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Tatiana began talking, really talking. She told him about school, her friends, and even little things, like a funny story about the lunch lady dropping a tray of spaghetti. Her father smiled more now, though his eyes still held a lingering sadness. One evening, as they washed dishes together, he finally worked up the courage to ask, "Tatiana, do you want to talk about what happened the other day?" "The lion?" She paused, her hands submerged in soapy water, and looked up at him. "I think it was Mom," she said simply. Her dad froze, the plate he was drying slipping from his hands onto the counter. "What do you mean?" Tatiana hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy, but she also didn't want to hide the truth. So she told him everything: the letter, the woods, the grave, and how the lion had seemed to guide her to it. Her father listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, She braced herself for him to tell her it wasn't real, that it was just her imagination. But instead, he let out a shaky breath and pulled her into a hug. "I believe you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know how, but I do." For the first time since the accident, Tatiana felt like they were truly connected again, like they were sharing the weight of their grief instead of carrying it alone. The town moved on, as towns do. The story of the lion faded from the headlines, replaced by other news. But for Tatiana, the memory of that day never faded. She began visiting her mother's grave regularly, bringing little offerings like flowers, drawings, or even her favorite book to read aloud. It wasn't scary anymore. It felt like a way to stay close to her. One chilly Saturday morning, Tatiana stood at the grave with her father. He held a bouquet of sunflowers, her mother's favorite, and placed them gently by the marker. "Do you think she's proud of us?" Tatiana asked, her voice small but steady. Her dad smiled through his tears. "I know she is. She always called you her Lionheart, remember?" Tatiana nodded, a soft smile tugging at her lips. I think she wanted us to be okay. That's why she sent the lion." Her father didn't respond right away. Instead, he knelt down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They sat in silence for a long time, the cold air nipping at their cheeks, but the warmth of their shared love keeping them steady. At school, Tatiana started a small project with Mrs. Delaney's help. She called it the Lionheart Club, a safe space for kids who were dealing with tough emotions. "We all have things we're scared of," Tatiana explained during the first meeting, her voice a little shy, but growing stronger with each word. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway." The club started small, just a handful of kids sitting in a circle in the library, but it grew quickly. Soon, more and more students came, sharing their stories, their fears, and their dreams. Tatiana listened to each one, offering quiet words of encouragement or simply a hug when they needed it. She never told them about the lion, or the letter, or her mom. That part of her story was private, sacred, but she carried the lessons with her, sharing them in her own way. One afternoon, months after the lion's visit, Tatiana walked home from school alone. The woods behind her house were quiet, their bare branches swaying gently in the winter wind. As she reached her backyard, she paused, her eyes scanning the tree line. She didn't expect to see it. She knew the lion was gone, but part of her still hoped in some small, secret way that it might return. But there was nothing there, only the soft rustle of leaves and the golden light of the setting sun. Tatiana smiled to herself, clutching her backpack straps. She didn't need the lion to come back. It had already given her everything she needed. She was her mother's Lionheart, and she always would be. That evening, as Tatiana sat at her desk doing homework, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The letter from her mom sat framed on the corner of her desk, the words etched into her memory. The world was full of mysteries, things that couldn't be explained. But one thing Tatiana knew for certain: love was stronger than anything. Stronger than fear, stronger than grief, even stronger than death. And as long as she held on to that love, she could face anything. Months turned into seasons, and seasons turned into years. Tatiana grew, as children do, but she never forgot the lion or the letter. They became a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. By the time she was a teenager, Tatiana's Lionheart Club had blossomed into something much bigger. What had started as a small circle of classmates at Willow Creek Elementary had spread across the town, and eventually, beyond it. Tatiana began speaking at community centers, schools, and even local events, sharing a message that had once been whispered to her in a clearing by an ancient tree. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are. She never told the full story. Not about the lion, not about the letter. But those who listened to her speak often felt a kind of magic in her words, as if she carried with her a secret strength that couldn't be explained. On the 10th anniversary of her mother's death, Tatiana returned to the woods. She was no longer the wide-eyed 8-year-old who had once stood trembling in front of the lion, but a confident young woman with the same steady heart. The tree was still there, as timeless as ever, its roots deep and unshakable. Tatiana knelt by her mother's grave, now adorned with flowers and trinkets left by her and her father over the years. "Hi, Mom," she said softly, placing a sunflower at the base of the stone. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, about what you taught me." She smiled, her chest tightening with the bittersweet ache that always came with thoughts of her mother. "I think you'd be proud of me. I hope you'd be proud." The woods were quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. And though there was no lion this time, no great beast emerging from the shadows, Tatiana felt the same warmth she'd felt that day. Her mother's love was still with her, as fierce and unyielding as the lion's amber eyes. Tatiana stood, brushing her hands off on her jeans. She turned toward the path that led back home, pausing for a moment to take in the woods one last time. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the branches, casting the world in a soft, ethereal glow. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. And as she walked away, the breeze picked up, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound, a deep, resonant rumble, like the distant echo of a lion's roar. Tatiana smiled. Life is full of mysteries, moments that can't be explained, but leave an indelible mark on our hearts. For Tatiana, the lion was more than just an animal. It was a symbol of love, of courage, of the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. We all carry grief in different ways. Some of us hide it, some of us let it consume us, and some of us, like Tatiana, learn to transform it into something powerful. Her story reminds us that being brave doesn't mean we aren't afraid. It means moving forward despite the fear, despite the pain, and trusting that the love we carry will guide us through. And maybe, just maybe, the ones we've lost are never really gone. Maybe they're closer than we think, in the rustling of the leaves, the warmth of the sun, or even the amber eyes of a lion. So when life feels overwhelming, remember Tatiana's lesson. Be a lion heart. Face the world with courage, knowing that love is stronger than anything. Because even in our darkest moments, there's always light waiting to break through.